Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Top 3 Secrets of Stress-Free Audit from Top Owners. This event is brought to you by Engineering News Record and sponsored by eBuilder. Hi, I'm Scott Seltz, publisher of ENR, and your moderator for today's event. Thank you for joining us. Today's presenter is Dan Connery, Capital Program Advisor at eBuilder. Throughout his 24-year career, Dan has leveraged a unique blend of backgrounds from the architect, engineering, and construction industry, project and program management, and the software industry to position tech companies for growth. He most recently served as Vice President of Business Development at Newforma. Joining Dan today is Paul Sheeran, Director of Financial Services at Memorial Hermann Healthcare System in Houston, Texas. Paul has 25 years of career experience, including 14 years providing financial analysis and accounting support for his company's construction program. Paul has spent 5 years in Memorial Hermann's internal audit department. He's had an abundance of experience in audits of construction projects and financial processes. Before we begin today's presentation, please enjoy this brief instructional video on how to use your webinar console.
Welcome to this webinar. Before we begin the presentation, I want to provide you with a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you will see a taskbar with icons. Each icon is assigned to a particular element of today's webinar. After the webinar is over, please take our survey to tell us how we've done. Throughout the presentation, you can network with others or submit questions to the speakers in the box next to the slides. Download resources from the folder icon. Today's event is being recorded and archived and will be available within 24 hours. For on-demand questions or comments, send us an email by clicking Email Us. If you experience any technical issues today, please refresh your browser by hitting F5 for a PC or Command R for Macs, or email webinars@bmpmedia.com for one-on-one support. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's moderator.
Don't forget to submit your questions during the presentation, and later in the program, our presenters will address as many as possible. Today's event is being recorded and archived on enr.com/webinars. And now I'm excited to turn it over to our first presenter, Dan Connery. Dan?
Excellent, thank you. So we wanted to start today's presentation with a quick poll, just understanding what type of organization are you from. So everybody should see that, and if you can go ahead and click through the appropriate response for you, that will help us understand a little bit better context of how to focus some of the content in the presentation. I'll give another 10 seconds for everybody to click through. All right, great. So thank you. So it looks like we have, of course, whenever you introduce an other category, it tends to always be the one that gets filled out the most, but that's fine. It looks like we have a good breakout between owners, builders, and designers. So that's fantastic. So thank you, everyone. So what I wanted to take you through, Scott had mentioned about the top 3 secret white paper, and I want to take you a little bit through what got us to that white paper. And what I found exciting about the research is that we didn't start out with the intent of writing a white paper about audits for capital projects. We went into a process where we did want to talk with financial people inside of owner organizations that do repeat building. And so we reached out throughout a group of customers and interviewed folks like Paul and asked them a series of very open-ended questions. So tell us a little bit about your typical day. What's a good day look like? What's a good week? Because I found if I asked about days, it was difficult for people, but they could tell me what a good week or a bad week look like. And then we also asked around what their impression of the capital program team was. So with asking these series of open-ended questions, it allowed us to just sit back and listen to the responses that we received. So I want to talk a little bit for you all, what type of organizations did we talk to? And so we went through the 5 major verticals, and that is government, healthcare, higher education, K through 12, and commercial. So we talked with financial people in all these different verticals to see, is there anything unique about different verticals? And as a result, we uncovered some pains. And what I'm going to do for you in this part of the presentation is talk about the ways that the answers to these questions kind of consolidated around four major areas. And I want to talk about conversations that we had with a chief financial officer or equivalent, so somebody who fills that role inside the organization. For example, a lot of government organizations don't necessarily have a CFO, but they have someone who fills that role. And so we asked a lot of questions, took a lot of notes, and then we went through a process of distilling those down to four primary pains. So people at the very top of the financial side of an organization talked about a concern around the governance and controls that are in place in their capital projects. One of the things that we learned during this research is that the top financial person inside these organizations typically spends the vast majority of their time outside of budget items that impact the capital programs. So they have they felt they had really good controls in place and processes in place for all the other aspects of what the organization does, but not necessarily on those areas that impact the capital projects. The second pain that we uncovered is that they don't really understand the construction side of the business. So again, if you're a hospital chief financial officer, or you're a top financial officer at a government institution or a higher education, you understand everything else that drives your business, because that's what your business is in the business of. However, when it came to the capital project side of things, they felt like it could be a black box. And the third thing we uncovered is that if the capital project program has a big bust, it's the chief financial person who gets pulled in front of whoever it is that you went and asked for money to fund those projects. So at the end of the day, the buck literally stops with these folks. And so when things go sideways and they need to go ask for more money, that's typically not a good feeling for the chief financial people. And then this is one that I hear no matter what I'm talking about, which is everybody just feels like they don't have enough time to take care of their stakeholders on a day-to-day basis. So they said one of their big challenges, what keeps them up at night, is their inability to be as responsive as they would like to. So those are kind of the four main categories we distilled answers of those questions into. And then we also interviewed folks like Paul on the call today, and wanted to understand for folks that are involved in a little bit more of the day-to-day operations, what were their pains, and we wanted to see if there's a correlation between the two roles. And so there we uncovered, this is where the audit component really came to light for me. So the upper financial management talked about process and controls, but when I spoke with controllers, they specifically talked about audits. And it's embarrassing when your organization is the recipient of a poor audit. They also talked about the fact that they get aggravated by the fact that they don't have an opportunity to have an impact on changes. So they find out about changes late in the process when it's too late. You just got to go find more money, as opposed to finding out that there may be a change coming and have an opportunity to weigh in about ways you could address that before it becomes a problem. Another area that came out for controllers specifically is dealing with the late payments. So we had companies that we talked to before implementing a project management information system that routinely paid contractors, not other parts of their business, but the contractor side late, and therefore they racked up late fees. And the controllers looked at that as literally wasting money. That money could have been put better to use either in the capital program or elsewhere within the institution. And finally, it was talking about the amount of time it takes in order to get program level information. So the project managers, the people actually managing the capital projects, if they're not using an integrated system, they'll typically, what we're used to hearing is they're using Microsoft Excel to manage the cost on their projects. Well, the controller wants to understand how are we doing across a portfolio of our projects. So maybe all projects in the Southeast. Well, 4 project managers in the Southeast are using 4 iterations of the spreadsheet, so that information needs to be manually consolidated, and that can take weeks. I had some folks admit to me it could take months. And now you have executives making decisions on outdated information, which honestly is actually the better news. If you're trying to consolidate across 4 different project managers' spreadsheets, most likely there's going to be errors of entry, and therefore you're actually making decisions based on incorrect information. So that was a big frustration area for the controllers. So for today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the primary pain that we uncovered for the CFO and the primary pain we uncovered with the controller, which is that around auditing, process, and policies and procedures. So with that, one of the things that we uncovered within the owner organizations that we interviewed is there tends to be a divide that exists between the financial team and the capital program team. And this, again, is before the implementation of a PMIS system. So, and I already spoke to where some of that divide exists. I want to, as a project manager, use a spreadsheet that helps me manage my projects, and maybe I don't care as much how that impacts the ability of the financial team to do their jobs. And similarly, the financial team really wants to make sure we have good controls in place so we don't run into audit problems, and that may slow down the project team, and therefore the project team doesn't appreciate that. So there's a divide that exists between these 2 parts of the business. And as a result of all that interviewing and research and consolidation of pain statements, we came up with a white paper that will be available to everybody on the call called The Top 3 Secrets of a Stress-Free Audit for Capital Projects. Though when I was talking with Paul about this presentation, he wasn't sure that he's ever been through a truly stress-free, so maybe we call it less stressful audit process. So what I want to jump into here is what auditors want to see. So when talking with folks like Paul and his peers in the industry, we uncovered the primary things that when an auditor comes in, whether or not it's an internal auditor and you have an internal audit department, or it's an external third-party auditor who's coming in, we found that there were some commonalities that these folks are looking for. And so the biggest component is they want to ensure 2 things. One, you actually have a process and you have controls defined. And secondly, that you actually follow those processes and those controls. So have them and then demonstrate that you follow them. The first half of that equation you can do without a PMIS system. You can document what your policies and procedures are. However, demonstrating that you're actually following them can be extremely problematic if you're not investing in some sort of PMIS solution for your capital project team. You want to make sure that the policies related specifically around changes, because typically what the auditors are looking for has to do with financial information. So, and changes is where there's an opportunity for things to be done typically unintentionally, incorrectly, or there are instances that you can read about where people intentionally, i.e. from a fraudulent perspective, were able to siphon money out of programs because there was not a good system in place to ensure people were adhering, for example, to signature limits. And then you're going to be asked to be able to produce documentation that has to do with costing, contracts, change orders, invoices, and then demonstrate that all of these followed the process that we uncovered in the first item. And then we want to make sure that signatures and approvals were gathered appropriately. So if Dan has a signature authority of $10,000 on a change order, then an auditor may come in and say, show me change orders for $15,000 and demonstrate that Dan's signature is not on any of those. So having a system in place to help collect this information rather than waiting until the auditor comes in is typically going to be much better for you. So I want to move into a second poll, and I'm going to ask you, for those of you that are audited, we now have a question of how often. So is your capital projects audited? And you have 4 choices to select from. So never, you're audited typically once a year, it's once every couple years, or more than once a year. So folks can go ahead and start filling in that for me. And we'll see if what I'm used to, which so far it's tracking pretty much where I thought it would. For those who are answering that you've never been audited, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Yeah, so far it's splitting between, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. So you'll see it's splitting between once a year and more than once a year. And so that's where investing in a solution that's going to help make those audits go more quickly is typically going to be a good idea. So thank you for that. So let's dig into those top 3 secrets now. And this is where I'm going to finally let Paul start to interject some great wisdom and some color to what I'm presenting. But let me set what those 3 secrets are. I'm going to give you a little bit of background from a general perspective, and I'm going to ask Paul to jump in and give us some specifics in his personal experience. So again, we're anchored around audits. And there were 3 areas that we uncovered that were uniform across everybody that we interviewed. Number 1, simplify the adherence to the process and controls. So if you have process and you have controls that you want people to follow, the simpler you make that to follow, the more likely it is that people are going to follow it. Now I know that sounds really maybe silly on its face, but I'm amazed at how many people create very complicated processes and make it very hard to follow and then are shocked when nobody follows them or actively work around following them. So make it as simple as possible. The second secret that we're going to dive into is that you need to strike a balance between the people, the process, and the technology. 100% of the top financial people that I spoke to, 100% of them, said that first you must make sure your processes are good, then you must make sure that you have the right people in place, and then you go and find a technology. And I'll talk about why that is in a little bit. And then the third secret that we uncovered is that you want to let project managers use a solution that was actually designed for them. And where this really came out is examples of people that we spoke to who the finance team either asked or forced the project team to use the ERP system the finance team was using. So whether or not that's Lawson, SAP, PeopleSoft, JD Edwards, whatever it is, someone will always say, well, we already have a system. Let's get the project team to use our ERP system. And I can count on one hand, if I had no fingers up, how many times I've heard that actually work successfully. So this is my favorite quote. Somebody pulled me aside during one of these interviews and he said, you do not ever want to be on the receiving end of a bad audit report. So, and what we find is a lot of customers, before they become customers, we're typically on the receiving end of a bad audit report, and that's when they go out and look for a system. So what I'm hoping to do is help you understand how you can get ahead of that. So with that, I want to dive a little bit in each one of these 3 secrets in some more detail. So let's peel back this simplifying adherence to process and control, so the first secret that we talked about. So at a summary level, which is the top of each one of these sections, what I learned, and this was surprising, is that, and remember, the context for everything I'm sharing with you, the context of every quote you're going to read, is from the financial team's perspective. So it used to be that the project managers did their own thing. And the part I bolded here, it was on us, the finance team, to take all of their information and put it into a document that made sense and told a story. And by the way, it made sense to the auditors. So what you had is the project team doing project work, and then the finance team redoing a lot of that work in order to make sure that the audit was going to pass well. And the part that I didn't include here is what that meant is you had people who should be spending time on looking at the finances of the project and doing the job they were paid to do, and diverting some of that time to make sure they were going to pass their audits. And that was just profound to me. It just boggled my mind. And so another one of the items is they talked about implementing a PMIS system provided more structure and more accuracy. And so the part that I bolded is that's why we implemented an owner-based project management information system. So because they needed to get everything out of spreadsheets into something. And again, that's typically because it's the result of an audit finding. And then what I love this quote is that by implementing this system, because one fear is you implement a system, it's just going to cause more work, right? It's going to take more time to get your job done. And so what we routinely hear is actually it streamlines work, not just for the financial team, because if it takes the finance team's time and cuts their time in half, but it doubles the work the project team has to do, project team is not going to like that. So in this instance, what we discovered is that not only, of course, save time for the finance team, because they're not doing what I talked about in the first section, but it also saved time for the project team. So I want to hit pause on my section and give Paul. Paul, is there any color that you want to add to this section?
Well, just in general, I want to say that from the audit standpoint, I've been an auditor and I've been on the receiving end of audits. That the mindset of the auditor is that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And where I've seen a lot of people get into hot water in this area is they either didn't have policies and procedures, or they were vague, which left a lot of room for interpretation, or they had the policies and procedures and they weren't enforced. And so, and another issue related to that is when there's a deviation from policy, there wasn't a documented explanation as to why there was such a deviation. So I think that's really important, and a system like eBuilder can be really useful. The tool is there, but it has to be implemented and utilized effectively to be of any help in this area.
Good. And then one of the other things when Paul and I were talking about this session today that he mentioned that struck me was that if you also have a policy in place that has so many exceptions to it, that the policy itself becomes almost meaningless. And this gets back to that balancing the people, the process, and the technology. No technology that I know of is going to fix a broken process. So you got to make sure your process is buttoned down, but what a technology can do is make sure that people follow the process. They may not like it, but it can make sure that they follow it. All right. Excellent. All right, so let's move on to secret number 2, and I do want to remind you, if throughout these areas while I'm talking about it, there's a question that strikes your fancy, something you wish we dug into more, please use your panel to go ahead and submit those questions so we have something to do at the end of the presentation. So I want to really hammer this home because it was hammered home to me so heavily by every chief financial officer that I spoke with, and that is striking the balance between people, process, and technology. So on the outside, on the periphery of everything is the technology. So that is the last thing that you want to worry about. And then in the middle is the people, and then at the core is the process. So without a well-defined process and a well-engineered process, everything else honestly is meaningless. And one of the things that I was surprised when coming to eBuilder is that it's not just about the technology. Our implementation folks actually spend an equal amount of time going through the process and make sure the process is right before you then implement the technology. So regardless of what PMIS solution you may move forward with, make sure you invest in your processes and invest the time to make sure they're the right process, because all technology is going to do is help you do whatever you're doing faster. If you're doing bad things, you're just going to do bad things faster. So again, process, then the people, and then the technology. So as far as striking that balance, this is where I learned a lot from the folks that I interviewed of how they struck that balance. So this is an example of what the before a PMIS state was like. So poor process resulted in significant audit findings. And so because they had lack enforcement, Paul talked about that, where the policy was in place but it wasn't enforced, an auditor came in and that's what they're paid to do, is find where these busts are, and either you don't have the process, which again our technology can't help you with that, or you have the process which people didn't follow it. And then we move on to documents being spread all over the place. So in this particular instance, somebody mentioned they had SharePoint, they had Dropbox, they had Box. Somebody on the project was using Google Drive, and a bunch of people put stuff on their local hard drives. And then they had to go find documents. You can imagine what that was like. And I love the end quote to this, and this is actually why they picked a PMIS solution, is after this project went sideways, the CFO came to this individual and said, you can never let this happen again. and so they went out hunting. Again, I'm hoping to get to people before this happens. And then finally, this was my favorite part about, so what's the cost savings? And so in this one instance, a single $2 million capital project could take up to 40 hours in order to get what the auditor needed. And then after the implementation of a PMIS solution, that was cut by up to 55 to 60%. So I often tell people that if you're looking at the cost of implementing a PMIS solution, typically the savings in auditing alone can justify the cost, regardless of the benefit that it's going to bring to the actual people that it's built for, which is the capital project team. So again, I'm going to pause here and see, Paul, what color would you like to add?
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially I've seen situations where maybe the bid documentation, for example, or approvals were obtained in writing, but they weren't scanned or attached in eBuilder, and it maybe was in someone's desk drawer. And so when the auditors came along, I mean, eBuilder is a great tool where they can go in and do a lot of the work just on their own, pulling up information. But if there isn't a policy in place to enforce the use of attaching that documentation in the PMIS tool, then it's not going to be very effective. So you need some good procedure in place and enforcement of that procedure to make sure that happens, because if the documentation is in place and stored where expected, then yeah, you can significantly reduce the amount of audit time. And one thing that we've tried to do is kind of standardize the way that our folder structure is laid out so that there's consistency between projects, so that the auditor can go, they know exactly where to go on every project to find the documents that they need, as opposed to 50 different folder structures where it makes it a lot more difficult. And small details like a document naming convention where you set up a consistent way in which documents are named makes it a lot easier for the auditor to find information, and it just presents a better, certainly instills more confidence in the auditor when they can find information more easily, and you don't have to take a day or two or a week to try to hunt down something that should have been an eBuilder in the first place.
Yeah, and the story that I'll share along those lines, one of the other interviewees shared with me, is the fact that before implementing a PMIS solution, when the auditor came in, they needed to pull the project team in because the project team knew where all this stuff was stored. So whatever the auditor was asking for, the capital project team would have to go find the contracts and the invoices, et cetera, et cetera. After the implementation of the PMIS solution, now they actually provide a login to that said solution to the auditor. And since implementation, the auditor very, very, very infrequently ever needs to talk to the project team. So again, that's when I got back to, it can't just be a win for the financial team, it needs to be a win for the project team, and the project team loves the fact they don't get called into audits anymore. Again, it's very, very infrequent that happens. So good, so let's talk about the last secret, and I want to spend actually a good chunk of time on this one, which is let the project managers use a solution that was designed for them. So if you remember, I talked about organizations who tried to get the project managers to use the ERP solution. Since they're managing contracts and invoices and change orders for the rest of the business, why not just use that ERP system to manage contracts, invoices, and change orders for the capital project team? And we don't have enough time left in the day, never mind in this session, to talk about why that's typically not a good idea. So you want to make sure that you have a solution that's designed specifically to help that team do their jobs that then benefits the finance team. And that's kind of the win-win. So one of the comments is that my top comment here is that the work that the auditing team needs should simply be an artifact of the project team using the technology. In other words, the project team shouldn't have to do extra work. It should just happen. happen. And so the quote here is, before, an individual on my team, again, the context of my is on the financial team, had to type all of their contracts into a second system for the auditors. And now, after the implementation of the PMIS, all of that's done automatically. So the contract is pushed through its approval cycle. Who needs to sign the contract is already known by the process. So you don't have to worry about somebody getting an incorrect signature, not because they're trying to do something wrong, but because they simply just didn't know, and I'm in a rush and I just want to get this signed, or a change order. I just need to get this thing signed because I have crews on site that aren't going to work if I can't get this signed. So they're just going to do what they need to do to get their jobs done. It's going to be the, do it and then ask for forgiveness later. Well, the auditor is not going to forgive you later. So if the system's in place to help ensure that people are adhering to the processes, but also helps them get their jobs done faster, then that's a win-win situation. And then I like this one as what took weeks before now takes days. So the process shaved down what used to take us maybe a week to a few days. So you're talking up to 60% savings. That gets back to that 55 to the 60% savings that I had on the prior slide. And you can see that in this particular instance, not only did this organization implement a PMS solution, they integrated it with DocuSign. So that now means that all of the contracts are electronically signed. Change orders are all electronically signed. And so that is saving the project team time. And because the process ensures the right people are signing it and the software actually collects the signatures, everything is done according to both the process as well as the approval control matrix as far as how high can somebody sign a change order or a purchase order. One company that I visited mentioned they are actually using the ERP solution. And I can tell you that it's not successful because they shared with me that anything over $10,000 from a change order, from an invoice perspective, needs the CFO's signature. Now, inside that organization's day-to-day operations, that makes perfect sense. That's probably a good threshold. For change orders in a contract project, when they're in the middle of a construction project, that person gets several of those every single day, and they're typically a week, 2 weeks behind signing and approving these, and it's just a nightmare. There's no reason why the CFO has to sign a change order for a capital project team that's $10,000, but because they're using the ERP solution, they can't diverge those two. So this, again, it gets back to make sure you have a tool and a technology in place that was designed for the customer. So the beauty about most of the PMS solutions you're going to look at, you will build your change order workflow process. You will build your application for payment approval process. You will build your invoicing process. And as a result of me just doing my job, I want to submit, the contractor comes in and submits their pay app. It goes through the process. You know exactly every single step of the process, when it was received, who looked at it, who moved it along to the next step, what the next step was, who signed for it. All the auditing stuff that you need to prove later on is tracked automatically by the system. So dates, signatures, everything is automatically audited. So that's when I talked about the work done as an artifact of using the technology. Paul, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I would agree, and we're using the processes module in eBuilder to document the approval routing history, and we involve the internal audit team during the development of that. And I would encourage any organization to do that in developing your procedures and expectations so that everyone is on the same page as far as what the routing history needs to include, what the documentation requirements should look like, how it should be stored, how to find it. I think if you take that little extra time up front, it's going to result in a lot less of headache later on from an audit standpoint.
Yeah, and one of the other stories I'll share with you was someone had mentioned they were at a conference and the capital team had been swept up in an audit by actually as an equipment purchasing audit that was being done for equipment for this particular organization. and somehow the capital project team got swept up in that audit. So they were at a conference, they got a phone call saying, you need to come back, you got to get out of your conference, come back here because there's a bunch of documents that the auditors need to see. And this particular controller was the one working with the capital project team. And at the conference, they were able to log in, find every piece of documentation that the auditor needed and send it to them without having to leave and miss the conference. So they told me that before implementing a PMS solution, they would have gotten on the plane and flown back because there's no way they would have been able to chase down what they needed. So good. So I'm going to go ahead and transition now into our Q&A section. So Scott, am I going to hand this back to you?
Yes, thank you, Dan and Paul. That was a great presentation. And if you haven't submitted a question yet and you'd like to do so, please do, because now Dan and Paul are going to field as many as time allots and as many as we receive. On that note, I actually do have a couple of questions in mind for Paul. So Paul, if you're ready, here's the first question. Do the project management and project finance people roll up into the same part of your organization?
You know, we used to have the project accounting finance function as part of project management. A couple of years ago, those project management and project finance were separated into, we're now part of the corporate accounting department. I think that works better in my opinion, because I think the two aspects of that, project management and project finance, have sometimes different and sometimes conflicting goals, and so they each have their expectations that they have to address, but in our organization those functions are separate.
I see. You know, and it occurred to me too, another question is, how early do you get, and how early do you become aware of a project? And there's a second part to this. Is it better to be aware early, and how early in your experience?
I would think from the finance side, it's better to be involved very early on, or at least at the time that the overall funding of the projects is done. If you have like a capital council that approves projects, then that they can provide the finance group with a list of what's been approved, so that the finance group has some idea of what projects are coming up. And what you want to avoid is a situation where you get an invoice on a project that you didn't even know was underway or existed, and you don't have a funding source to pay for it. That's kind of the other extreme that can happen. So I would say at least at probably the funding approval stage, we would need to be involved.
Yeah, good. We're still expecting some questions to come in, but I do have one more for you, Paul. So when you're selecting PMIS solution, how early are you involved? Were you involved in the implementation, for example?
Yes, I was involved from the very beginning of the implementation, and which I think was good. We could build in a lot of the financial controls that were needed, and I think that's, in my opinion, a must to have the project management and the project finance people working together closely to make sure that all the different objectives are addressed, because what you don't want to have is one group focuses solely on their needs and they don't take into consideration the other group's needs. And if you're implementing anything that interfaces with another financial system like SAP or Lawson, you would want to get your IT people involved as well, perhaps even supply chain, depending on how advanced or integrated you want your processes to be, because we utilize a number of electronic processes where eBuilder and Lawson are interfaced, and that required some programming and IT involvement to make that happen. So the earlier IT, project management, project finance are involved, the better, and they should really be working closely together.
That's very good. I don't think we've received any additional questions. Dan, is there anything you want to say before we come to close?
No, I just want to thank everybody for attending. Those of you that mentioned you get audited once or more than once a year, again, I hope you got some value out of the 3 secrets, and you really should be out looking for a PMIF solution to help make sure those audits go smoothly.
Great. And everybody, please join me in thanking Dan Connery and Paul Shearson for this presentation, as well as our sponsor, eBuilder. If you have any questions or comments that you didn't get a chance to voice, please simply click on the Email Us button on the console, and either Dan will probably get back to you with an answer. As you exit today's web seminar, please take a couple of moments to complete our survey. We strongly welcome your detailed comments, and please visit enr.com/webinars for the archive of this presentation, as well as information about our upcoming events. Make sure you tune back in for next week's webinar, Successful Integration of a Merged Company, that's airing August 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We hope you found this webinar to be a good investment of your time, and thank you very much, and have a great day.